What if the biggest irregularity heading into 2026 isn't something teams discovered, but something the FIA and Mercedes quietly dealt with long before anyone else noticed? Because after details of a private handling of a controversial 2026 engine issue leaked, the paddock didn't react with shock at the technical side. They reacted to the timing, and to the fact that this discussion may have happened while other teams were still designing in the dark. Behind closed doors, sources suggest this wasn't a sudden problem. It was identified early, debated quietly, and managed in a way that avoided public scrutiny until now. That's when questions turned uncomfortable very quickly. And here's the reason this story is far more serious than it sounds. If the irregularity was never officially resolved, only informally contained, then this leak isn't about one engine detail. It's about whether the rules were enforced equally or selectively. And once you realize what that could mean for 2026, it becomes very hard not to stay with this story until the end. Once the details of this irregularity began to circulate, the reaction inside the paddock was immediate and unusually restrained. Not because teams weren't angry, but because they understood the scale of what this implied. This wasn't a loophole discovered late or a gray area exploited creatively. It was an issue identified early enough to trigger private conversations at the highest level. Conversations that, according to sources, never reached the rest of the grid in any meaningful way. That silence is what has now become the real point of conflict. What teams find most troubling is the suggestion that this irregularity sat in a regulatory limbo. Not clearly legal, not clearly illegal, but acknowledged, discussed, and managed quietly through informal alignment rather than formal correction. In Formula One, that middle ground is dangerous, because it allows one project to move forward with confidence while others continue to self-police under stricter assumptions. By the time the discrepancy becomes visible, the damage is already structural. According to insiders, the issue wasn't about a single component or an obvious measurement breach. It was about how the 2026 engine architecture interpreted a core principle of the regulations: energy flow, control logic, interaction between electrical systems. The kind of complexity that doesn't trigger alarms immediately, but reshapes performance ceilings over time. That's why the FIA's early awareness matters so much. Because once a concept like that is allowed to mature, stopping it becomes almost impossible without rewriting intent itself. Inside rival teams, the feeling isn't just frustration. It's betrayal of process. Teams accept that innovation will always create winners and losers. What they don't accept is discovering that the referee may have been quietly managing one side of the game while everyone else was playing blind. Even if Mercedes acted within the letter of the law, the perception now is that they were operating with a level of contextual clarity others never had access to. And perception, in this sport, carries as much weight as proof. The FIA now faces a crisis that can't be solved with technical language alone. Clarifying the rule today doesn't change the fact that decisions were made years ago under different assumptions. Issuing guidance now doesn't give teams back the time they lost. And denying wrongdoing doesn't explain why the issue never triggered a wider directive when it first surfaced. Every option available now feels reactive, not corrective. That's why tensions continue to rise rather than settle. What makes this situation especially volatile is the proximity to 2026. Budgets are committed. Design paths are locked. Engine concepts are too far along to pivot meaningfully. If this irregularity provided even a small head start, that advantage is now baked into the foundations of one project while others are effectively stuck chasing shadows. That's not a sporting imbalance teams can tolerate quietly. It strikes at the credibility of the reset itself. And this is where the story deliberately refuses to close. Because the leak hasn't confirmed guilt. It has exposed process. It has raised questions about how irregularities are handled when they're inconvenient, complex, or politically sensitive. How many other issues were resolved quietly? How many interpretations were shaped before the rest of the grid knew they existed? And as teams push for answers, one thing is already clear. This isn't just about a 2026 engine detail anymore. It's about whether Formula One can still claim that the rules apply equally even when enforcing them is uncomfortable. As the implications of this leak continue to spread, a deeper concern is beginning to crystallize among teams. This isn't just about whether an irregularity existed. It's about how the system responds when an irregularity is inconvenient. Teams are now asking whether the FIA's role is to enforce clarity immediately or to manage risk quietly when enforcement might destabilize the competitive order. That distinction matters, because managing risk may protect short-term stability, but it undermines long-term credibility. And credibility is the currency that keeps teams investing under restrictive rules. What unsettles rivals most is the idea that this issue may have been treated as a known unknown. Something acknowledged internally, but deliberately left unresolved publicly to avoid forcing a wider reset. If that's true, it means competitive balance wasn't preserved, it was deferred. Deferred until it became too late for anyone else to react meaningfully. Under a cost cap, that kind of delay isn't neutral. It effectively chooses winners and losers by freezing assumptions at different moments in time. Inside technical departments, this has sparked a wave of quiet retrospection. Engineers are revisiting early design choices, asking whether they unknowingly constrained themselves based on a stricter reading of the rules. Not because the regulations demanded it, but because the absence of guidance implied caution. If Mercedes was operating under a different contextual understanding, even informally, then the competitive landscape was never as level as teams believed. That realization is deeply corrosive, because it reframes years of disciplined compliance as a strategic disadvantage. There is also a growing fear about how this will influence future behavior. If irregularities can be contained quietly rather than corrected openly, teams will adapt. They will push harder. They will disclose less. They will assume silence equals tolerance. That cultural shift doesn't produce immediate chaos. It produces arms races built on secrecy rather than ingenuity. And once that mindset takes hold, regulation stops guiding innovation and starts chasing it. For the FIA, this is where the crisis becomes existential rather than procedural. A regulator can survive technical disputes. It cannot survive sustained doubt about impartiality. If teams believe issues are handled differently depending on who is involved, every future clarification becomes suspect. Every decision feels political. And once that perception hardens, restoring trust requires more than transparency, it requires sacrifice. Something the FIA has historically struggled to offer quickly. Mercedes' position in all of this remains legally strong but politically fragile. The team can credibly argue it followed the process available to it, that it disclosed, discussed, and aligned where required. But the controversy has already moved beyond individual responsibility. It now centers on whether the process itself is fit for an era where innovation happens faster than oversight. That's not a question Mercedes can answer, but it's one they may end up paying for reputationally regardless. And this is why the tension refuses to subside. Because the leak hasn't resolved anything. It has exposed a fault line between how Formula One wants to regulate and how it actually does when stakes are high. Whether this irregularity leads to formal action or quiet compromise, its impact is already locked in. It has changed how teams view the FIA. It has changed how they view each other. And most importantly, it has changed how they will approach the next major innovation, not with openness, but with suspicion. That may end up being the most lasting consequence of all. As the situation continues to escalate, a more unsettling realization is beginning to take shape behind closed doors. This leak didn't just expose an irregularity. It exposed a gap between regulation as written and regulation as practiced. Teams are now openly questioning whether the FIA's internal processes are equipped to deal with concepts that don't break rules cleanly, but bend their intent over time. When enforcement relies on judgment rather than thresholds, discretion becomes power. And power, when applied unevenly or invisibly, is exactly what teams fear most in a cost-capped era. What's particularly damaging is that this irregularity appears to have lived in a gray zone for an extended period. Not long enough to trigger emergency action, but long enough to influence architectural decisions. That time window is everything. Because in engine development, early architectural freedom determines everything that follows. Cooling strategies, energy recovery logic, control software priorities. If one project moved forward with confidence while others hesitated out of caution, the imbalance isn't theoretical anymore. It's structural. Inside rival teams, this has triggered a fundamental rethink of how compliance is interpreted. Previously, the safest route was conservative alignment with the strictest possible reading of the rules. Now, that philosophy feels naive. Teams are asking whether restraint is still rewarded, or whether it simply leaves space for others to push further under the cover of ambiguity. That shift doesn't lead to innovation. It leads to escalation. And escalation under regulatory uncertainty is how conflicts stop being technical and start becoming political by default. There's also growing concern about how selectively visibility operates within the FIA itself. If certain concepts are understood deeply by regulators long before others even realize they exist, transparency becomes uneven by design. Not because of intent, but because of access. And access, in modern Formula One, is everything. This leak has forced teams to confront an uncomfortable possibility. That the true competitive advantage may not be performance, but proximity to decision-making processes no one else can see. For the FIA, this is the most dangerous moment in the entire controversy. Because the issue is no longer whether they acted correctly. It's whether they can convincingly demonstrate that their internal handling of irregularities doesn't privilege continuity over fairness. Regulators often justify quiet management as stability. But stability that benefits one side more than others quickly stops looking neutral. And once that perception forms, authority erodes faster than any rule can restore it. What makes this even more volatile is that the irregularity itself may never be fully defined publicly. It may remain technical, abstract, and buried under confidentiality. That ambiguity ensures the controversy lingers. Because teams can't challenge what they're not allowed to see. They can only react to outcomes. And reacting to outcomes, rather than principles, guarantees resentment rather than resolution. And this is why the story cannot close here. Because the leak didn't settle the question of irregularity. It raised a more dangerous one. How many decisions shaping 2026 were made quietly, contextually, and irreversibly before the rest of the grid understood what was even possible? Until that question is answered convincingly, every assurance from the FIA will sound provisional. Every clarification will feel late. And every advantage will be viewed through the lens of suspicion rather than respect. This may not be the final chapter of the controversy. It may be the moment the sport realized how fragile its regulatory trust has quietly become. As the pressure builds further, another consequence of this leak is becoming impossible to ignore. Teams are no longer assuming that irregularities will be resolved through clear intervention. They are assuming they will be managed. And that assumption fundamentally changes how competitive behavior evolves. When management replaces enforcement, the incentive shifts away from compliance and toward negotiation. Teams begin asking not, "Is this allowed?" but, "How far can this go before it becomes uncomfortable?" That mindset is corrosive, because it transforms regulation from a boundary into a variable. What makes this particularly dangerous is that engine development does not tolerate uncertainty well. Once architecture decisions are made, they lock in years of consequences. If Mercedes was able to move forward while an irregularity sat unresolved, then every downstream decision benefited from that early confidence. Cooling concepts, energy deployment strategies, control software priorities. None of those can be reworked cheaply or quickly once frozen. So even if the FIA were to clarify or restrict something now, the asymmetry created earlier would remain embedded. Inside rival teams, this has created a sense of irreversible disadvantage. Not because they believe Mercedes cheated, but because they believe they were cautious at a moment when caution turned out to be costly. That kind of realization doesn't lead to calm dialogue. It leads to hardened positions. Teams feel punished for restraint and excluded from context they didn't know they needed. And once that belief takes hold, cooperation becomes transactional rather than principled. The FIA's problem now is that every explanation sounds retrospective. No matter how detailed or well-intentioned, it arrives after consequences have already formed. Regulators can explain why something wasn't addressed publicly. They can explain how decisions were weighed internally. But they cannot give teams back the freedom they lost while operating under incomplete information. That gap between explanation and restitution is where trust continues to erode. There is also growing concern about how this will affect future reporting of irregularities. If teams believe that early disclosure leads to quiet containment rather than collective correction, they may choose silence instead. That creates a perverse incentive structure. The teams most willing to push boundaries discreetly gain time and certainty. Those who engage openly risk being overtaken while waiting for clarity. Over time, that dynamic rewards secrecy and penalizes transparency, the exact opposite of what effective regulation requires. From Mercedes' perspective, this situation remains deeply uncomfortable even if they maintain technical innocence. Being at the center of a controversy about irregularity management places the team in a political spotlight they did not publicly seek. Every future success risks being reinterpreted through this lens. Every technical advantage becomes suspect by default. That reputational burden doesn't disappear with a ruling. It lingers, shaping narratives long after the original issue fades from view. And this is why the story remains unresolved, by necessity rather than choice. Because the leak didn't reveal a simple violation. It revealed a process problem, one that can't be fixed with a single directive or clarification. The real question now facing Formula One isn't whether the 2026 engine rules were broken. It's whether the system designed to protect fairness can still function when innovation outruns visibility. Until that question is answered convincingly, every step toward 2026 will carry an undercurrent of doubt. And in a sport built as much on trust as speed, doubt is the one thing no regulation can easily outrun.